I've got a job that I've delayed for years. Welcome to the underside of my favourite car. Esther does like to kill clutches. Hello and welcome to this video. I'm Marcus Hayes, and in this video I'm going to be cracking on with some jobs on my favourite car, Esther, the ST170 powered Mk1 Escort. I'm going to have another look at the ongoing saga that is Esther's clutch, but don't worry, the clutch is still working absolutely fine. It's just that I want to try and take away the noise that I've got currently coming from her release bearing. But before all that, I've got a job that I want to do that I was literally supposed to do when she first got put on the road. This is a job that I've delayed for years and years and years. It's fair to say that Esther is a little bit too clean for the amount that she gets abused. And to be honest, when I first started restoring this thing, the plan was never to abuse her. This car was literally the car that made me fall in love with Mk1 Escorts in the first place when it was owned by its previous owner, Dan. Massive shout out to you if you're watching. The original plan was to build this thing into a concourse modified car. I had dreams of taking her to car shows, putting mirrors underneath her, and yeah, just keeping her looking as pristine as I could. But the build took so many years that by the time she was actually on the road, I'd completely changed my mind in terms of what I wanted to do with her. But by then, it was too late to change how mint she was. I mean, when we were building this thing, it was literally stripped to a bare shell. It was in this garage for many years on a rotisserie while we painstakingly removed all the rust and then slowly started painting it up in stages. This thing has been painted on the outside, on the inside, on the underneath, the engine bay, inside the boot. Pretty much the whole car has been painted Olympic blue. This thing was originally white, but there are some areas on the car that inevitably you just can't paint, you know, inside chassis rails, inside the seals and that sort of thing. And in those areas, people normally pump in a load of wax oil or cavity wax. And I believe this car, in fact, had some sort of treatment like that from the factory, because it used to have a load of holes in the door aperture area where, from the factory, if you paid the optional extra, the cavities would get pumped with some sort of stuff. I think it's called Z-bar. Now, when we built this car, we welded those holes up just for a more clean look, but the guy that painted this car did pump some wax oil into certain areas. For example, in the seals, you know, there's areas like this where you can still see the wax oil, in fact, and you know, these holes along the seal were basically pumped with wax oil. There's another hole there and another hole there. So the inside of the seals, which wasn't painted, you know, had some protection on it. It's worth noting that these seals were replaced and we did actually paint the inside of them with weld through primer, but pumping areas like that with the wax oil just gives them, you know, another coating that can protect from future rust. If we were to remove the carbon fibre rear quarter card, for instance, you'd see that there's still traces in there of the wax oil at the bottom. Another area that got done was inside the heater bubble, which is obviously behind this heater. You know, that was pumped with wax oil before we fit the heater. Oh, and one other area that was done was in here. You can still see traces of wax oil in there. I cleaned it away from these areas because they're seen, and on this side, originally I didn't really clean much away because I used to have the original fuel tank, but once I fitted the alloy fuel cell, again, I, you know, cleaned away most of that wax oil. So you get the idea. Certain areas of the car were pumped with wax oil when the guy that did the paintwork, shout out to DJ Rev, to prevent future rust from those areas that don't get painted. But there was one area that wasn't done, and I always intended to take the car somewhere to get it done soon after we put this thing on the road, and that was years and years and years ago. Welcome to the underside of my favourite car, which is actually looking pretty filthy. One area that I have roughly cleaned up today is the chassis rails, and inside these chassis rails is where I want to put some sort of cavity wax. Now the product that I'm going to be using is this transparent wax coat from my friends at Kent Europe, and I actually used this stuff on Heidi, my Mark II Escort, inside her heater bubble and also inside the boot, inside the inner rear arches. And the great thing about the Kent Europe stuff is that you get this nozzle, which, you know, means that you can poke it into, for instance, the chassis legs, and at the end of the nozzle it's actually got like holes going around it so that you get a spray pattern where it sort of just sprays out in all directions. Let me give you a quick demo. So my plan is to basically go along the length of both of the chassis legs and poke this nozzle thing into holes like this, and then spray it as I'm pulling it out, and then that's just going to spray in all directions, you know, the whole of the inside of the chassis leg. There's also holes along it like this where I could poke it in, and yeah, just go along the chassis leg and just poke it into any hole that I see and try and get the whole of the inside of both chassis legs covered in this transparent wax coat stuff. I started at the back of the driver's side chassis leg, first poking the nozzle towards the rear of the car and then poking it back in towards the front of the car. Then I taped up the hole and started moving forwards along the chassis leg, poking the nozzle into every hole that I could see in both directions. There were less holes in the front of the chassis leg to use. I did find this little gap in the engine bay, but I don't actually think that that leads into the inside of the chassis leg. And then I found a hole hiding behind the front anti-roll bar bracket, which definitely enabled me to get the front of the chassis leg. One chassis leg down, one to go. The rear end of the passenger side was a little bit more difficult because of the exhaust being in the way, but it wasn't long until that side of the car was done as well. All right, job done, and I think it went pretty well. I'll leave all these bits of tape on here until I'm under the car next, and I've actually got a job I want to do very soon on this car in the next couple of days, but I'm waiting for something to come through the post first, and when I do that job I'll be able to give these inner rear tubs a bit of a clean because they are looking very grubby because yeah, the job that I've got in mind involves removing the rear wheels. But yeah, I was kind of worried, sort of, am I putting enough of that product on? But with a lot of the areas I was overlapping the sections. So for instance, you've got two holes here that are very close together, and I'd go both ways in this hole, so the nozzle was basically going in this hole and past this hole, but then I would still put it in this hole and go both ways as well. So, you know, the passes were overlapping, so I do think that I've got plenty in there. And eventually I'll give Heidi the same treatment as well. She won't be getting painted underneath at all, but I will eventually chuck some of this into her chassis rails. Anyway, there is one more thing that I want to have a look at on Esther today, and it's to do with her clutch. It's fair to say that Esther does like to kill clutches. I basically end up fitting multiple clutches per year. Very recently, I fitted a ridiculously cheap friction plate to this thing, and thankfully, the clutch seems to be working absolutely fine, which is awesome. But there is a weird noise coming from what I assume is the clutch release bearing. Now, it's going to be impossible for me to show you what I'm going to be cracking on with now, but luckily I've got a spare gearbox and some spare parts, so I can show you off the car exactly what I'm going to be doing. So this is my spare RX-8 6B gearbox, exactly same as the one that's fitted to Esther, and this runs a hydraulic clutch. Now, the slave cylinder for the hydraulic clutch is mounted here. I do have a spare one somewhere, but I can't find it. But you know, it mounts here, and in the end of the slave cylinder is this rod, which basically pushes against this arm when you push the clutch pedal. And on the end of this arm there should be a clutch release bearing. I don't have a spare one of them, and as you push this arm, the clutch release bearing pushes towards the clutch, as you can see, and the clutch release bearing that is attached to there pushes against the fingers of the clutch. This will obviously be mounted to your flywheel, and it'll be like that. Now the problem I'm getting is that I've got a bit of a rattly noise, which I think is coming from the clutch release bearing, and it goes away when I slightly press the clutch pedal. Now I believe what's happening is one of two things. Either the bearing is just overly worn and rattling, or the bearing is slightly engaging with the fingers of the clutch cover even when you've got your foot off the clutch. So it's kind of slightly being spun by this. And what should happen is when you've got your foot off the clutch, the bearing shouldn't be touching this at all. Now, one way that I mentioned in a previous video that I could basically prevent the noise is by lengthening this slave cylinder rod, so that basically even at rest this is leaning slightly on the lever, which then, you know, is putting a slight bit more pressure on the bearing, which ultimately is pressing against this even when your foot is off the clutch. But that's not going to really solve the issue properly, because then you're basically making sure that the bearing is touching this even when your foot is off the clutch, and that's not how it should be. So, you know, whilst I was at Carlo, the Precision Engineers, discussing about having an adjustable one of these rods made up, basically, he made me aware that what I should really be doing is trying to shorten this rod so that in theory, when my foot is off the clutch, there's less pressure on this arm. So this arm will be slightly more this way at rest, which will hopefully then mean that the bearing is pulled away from the clutch enough so that it's not touching the clutch at all when your foot is off the clutch. I hope that makes sense. So Carlo, the Precision Engineer, made me this, which is an adjustable one of these. This is basically in 2 pieces or 3 pieces with the nut. And yeah, this bit screws into this, and you can screw it in as far as you want and then lock it off with this nut. So I'm hoping that if I set this to be slightly shorter than the original one, right now it is, you know, probably a good 5 mil shorter. Yeah, I'm hoping that if I take the slave cylinder rod that's currently fitted to Esther, which is exactly the same as this one, out and fit this one, which is now shorter, I'm hoping that that will solve my issue. Someone actually got in touch recently with a really simple idea that I could try. So let me just explain that to you. So what they suggested was that I basically attach a little spring to this lever. So, you know, you could drill a hole in this lever and have the spring hooked on there, and then maybe have it hooked to a tab that's attached to the bell housing with the same bolts that holds the slave cylinder on, so that when you take your foot off the clutch, you know, it's spring loaded, you know, not a heavy spring obviously, and it just pulls this away slightly when your foot is at rest. And I think that's actually an awesome idea. I think it might be quite impossible to fit with the gearbox in situ, but I think in the not too distant future I'm going to take the gearbox off and replace the release bearing anyway, because, you know, it's making a load of noise, so it's probably worn. It's just that I'm trying to solve whatever issue I've got first, because if I put a new bearing in now, you know, eventually the issue is going to come back, because, you know, the bearing seems like it's probably engaged all the time. But yeah, massive shout out and a thanks to whoever it was that got in touch with the idea of a spring. And look, if this adjustable rod doesn't work, then when I do ultimately decide to take the gearbox off to replace the bearing, then I'll look at attaching a little spring to the arm. But for now, I'm going to throw this adjustable clutch rod in. I'm not going to be able to film the process. There's just, you know, no way that I can get a camera in there. So yeah, as you can see, I can't even show you the slave cylinder on camera. So this is going to be a case of me just trying to do it by feel. I don't think with my setup it's going to be possible to sort of fit the rod and then adjust it at all. It's just going to be a case of, you know, adjust it like I have now, so it's a little bit smaller than standard, put it in and then see if there's any change. All right, so what I only realised today is that I can see and access the slave cylinder from under the car quite well. And actually, to switch the rods round, I needed to loosen the bolts for the slave cylinder, and that was much easier from under here. But yeah, got the adjustable rod on, got the boot on. It still sort of, you know, rattles about, which is to be expected. So the noise might actually just be this rattling around, but the spring idea would stop that. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that if this doesn't work, then that spring method will. But yeah, fingers crossed. It's a bit better now with the adjustable rod on. Let's have a look. Well, do you know what? The noise has gone. There's actually more noise when I press the clutch than when I'm not pressing the clutch, which could just be that the bearing is worn out because all this time it has been leaning against the pressure plate. And it's worth noting that I didn't change this bearing when I changed the clutch recently. So I think the adjustable rod has done the job. The only thing I need to make sure now is that the clutch disengages properly when I do press the pedal. And I need to make sure that I haven't adjusted the adjustable rod too short. I suppose the only way to find that out is to take it for a test drive. All right, well, the car shifts absolutely fine, which is good. I was actually around the garage for about an hour after I spoke to you last, and I've raised my catch can up a bit in the engine bay. It's actually as high as it will go without it fouling on the underside of the air intakes that Gary Ball put into this carbon fibre bonnet, so it can't go up any higher. The catch can's still spitting out a little bit of oil from the breather on top of it. I don't know whether I've got too much crankcase pressure, maybe the bottom end is worn, or whether my tank is too small, or yeah, I mean, maybe raising the tank up a little bit will help, because how it was before, the filter was lower than my breather fitting on my rocker cover. I might actually try and stuff the breather with some wire wool or something, you know, or put gauze in it or something, just to prevent so much oil spitting out. Nowadays I run a little bit less oil in the engine. You know, I've still got fine oil pressure and stuff, so I'm not running it with not enough oil in it, but that seems to have made a bit less oil come out of the filter on the catch can. It's only when I really rag it that I get a little bit pouring out. So yeah, I was around the garage for a bit, you know, raising my tank up, obviously packing up, and yeah, I've decided to basically take this car home with me. However, the clutch noise is still there. It definitely seems a bit better than it was, you know, but like how it was before, if you push it a little bit, the noise gets louder, and then you push it more and it goes away. It's really annoying because when it was jacked up around the garage, there was more noise when I pushed the clutch than when I wasn't pushing the clutch. But I suppose now I've been driving it, you know, a couple of miles, everything's sort of settled. But I do think that, you know, if I play with the length of that adjustable rod, maybe shorten it a bit more and see if it improves it again, because I do think it's a bit better than it was. And then eventually I'll throw a new release bearing in, and whilst I'm doing that job, whilst the box is off, I'll drill the clutch arm and sort of attach a tab, as I mentioned earlier in this video, under one of the bolts that holds the slave cylinder on, so that then I can add a spring once the box is back, you know, in situ fitted to the car. And I do reckon that the noise will either go away when I fit a new bearing, and hopefully the shorter rod will prevent the new bearing wearing prematurely, or it's just a case of things rattling around and then it will go away with the spring. So yeah, I do reckon I'll get to the bottom of it, but ultimately I'm just happy that at the moment her clutch seems to be working fine. Now I'm not sure whether that wax stuff that I put in Esther's chassis today needs time to go off. I assume so, you know, I'm assuming that it's going to dry and sort of stay, you know, soft but sticky. But you know, I was around the garage for a couple of hours, you could say, after I applied it, so maybe it's had a chance to set a bit. I have left the tape over the holes on the chassis, so I don't think I'm, you know, doing it any harm driving Esther home today. I just love driving this thing, so I thought, why not? I'm still waiting for Microblast Services to get back to me about the manifolds that they're refinishing for me. So as soon as I get a call from them, I will be going to collect those bits, and I'll show you those bits. And then, you know, I'll be cracking back on with Heidi. So yeah, looking to stay super busy this week. And yeah, it's less than 2 weeks now, as I mentioned in the last video, until the Classic Ford show. So if you are going to the Classic Ford show, do come over and check out my stand. Massive shout out to all you guys that have got in touch to get on my stand. There's over 30 cars on the list, so it's going to be awesome hanging out with you all. We've got free cake for everyone First come, first serve. But for you guys that are actually on my stand, I've got an exclusive show sticker for you guys, and I'm going to give you a free MH air freshener as well. So yeah, really looking forward to that. Another thing that I found out recently, which is really cool, the classic car show at Scalabrini. It's in Borehamwood. It's like an old people's home that's run by nuns and stuff, and they do a classic car event every year. It's an Italian church that sort of looks after this old people's home. So, you know, at this classic car event, or this car event, you get loads of Ferraris and Italian stuff, but also loads of Fords, just a real mix of classic cars. Now, that was due to be on the 12th of May, the same day as Classic Ford Show. So I was kind of gutted that I wasn't going to be able to go to the classics at the Villa, at Villa Scalabrini. But they've actually rescheduled it because they've had a lot of rain, and they don't think that their field is going to dry out, basically, you know, within the next couple of weeks. They've rescheduled it until June. So yeah, really awesome that I'm able to go to that event. And of course, I will be having my own stand at the Ford Show at Santa Pod, which is in July as well. And you know, in and amongst all those events, going to be trying to get out and about as much as I can to check out as many cars as I can, and you know, hang out with as many petrol heads as I can, and make the most of the very short-lived summers that we have over here in England. Well, I didn't get to rag it too much on the way home, but no oil whatsoever has come out of that catch can. So I wonder if raising it up has helped. I will reposition the bracket properly one day. I've just spaced it with nuts for now. All right, time for me to get myself ready for a leg session tonight in the gym, and I'm going to take Esther for a blast to and from the gym tonight. Why not? Then I'm going to come home and start editing this video and continue working with another little venture I've been working on behind the scenes. I am planning to do some more bits on Esther this week, and hoping to dive into doing more bits on Heidi as well. So stay tuned to the channel for future videos, and definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Got to send a massive thanks out to the guys at Kent Europe, and of course out to Carlo, the precision engineer at AR Valley and Sons in Uxbridge. I will leave their links in the description, as well as all of mine for you guys that want to follow me on social media and that sort of thing. So that's it for this video. I'll be back in a few days for another one. Massive thanks to everyone who has tuned in. Special thanks as always to my patrons for your ongoing support. But other than that, I'll chat to you next time.